do what thou wilt. Shall be the whole of the law. Welcome everybody to the next class in our series on little essays towards truth. And tonight we're going to be discussing energy and knowledge. So let's hop right in. Let me bring up the text on the screen. There we go. Stephen, if you could go ahead and read our first paragraph there.
Sure. Energy is the sacramental motive of event. It is thus omnipresent in manifestation by interruption and compensation, and otherwise by the corresponding withdrawal. In this connection, let there be remembered the full formula of the Tetragrammaton.
Okay, there's, as always, a lot packed into that paragraph.
Yeah.
Basic idea here is that just as in Einstein's relativity, energy is the basic stuff of reality. Okay, what do we mean by energy? So let's put some definitions out there. So energy, basically in physics, has, for most intents and purposes, the same definition that it did for the Greeks. So specifically in Aristotle, energy or energeia in Greek means the ability or capacity to do some work, to cause some alteration or change in the world, particularly attributed to human beings with our activity, but also applying to, in principle, to any kind of causal efficacy in reality has to involve some kind of energy that affects or effectuates the change. So basically, by the time you get to the new physics, it's understood that mass is basically, or stuffness, substantiality, is itself a kind of expression of energy. You could say in an extremely imprecise way that it's a kind of maybe frozen energy. Energy that's been related to itself in such a way as to become structured in a complex way that is less fleeting than the more quantum or electromagnetic form of it. But it is an emergent property of what fundamentally is these energetic fluctuations of quantum fields that extend universally throughout reality. And so in that sense, energy is the basic stuff of reality. So therefore, when Crowley is talking about that it's omnipresent, that it is manifestation itself, that it does so through interruption and compensation and a corresponding withdrawal. In other words, is through a kind of convoluted self-relationship with itself that it develops more complex forms. And we are, in a sense, the expression of that energy. Now, that's in terms of physics, but then there's also a psychological correlate of that, which derives from Freud, and I think is very important in polemic philosophy, and particularly for what we might call either sex magic, or more broadly, the function and nature of the true will. So what do I mean? Well, in Freud's initial psychoanalytic theory, which is modified, but nevertheless remains basically the same throughout his career. He sort of adds to it as he goes, whether that's the Oedipal complex or the theory of the dual drives or whatever. But the basic starting point is the libido theory of the psyche. And the initial form of this is what's sometimes called by Freud scholars the psychic energy theory, but that's a little bit misleading because formally that's replaced by the Oedipal theory at a certain point, but there are certain theoretical assumptions that remain the same throughout all Freud's work. And one of these is that the basic structuring of the psyche is based around what in psychology is called affectivity, and has to do with the kind of emotional investment that we have in our states of mind. So that stuff doesn't just happen to us, it matters to us, or that we experience ourselves as subjectively as a psyche involved in it. Or another way to put this more philosophically is that our experience matters to us in a certain way. And this relates to the concept of will, that there's a certain quality of will to the psyche that gives it a kind of orientation towards the world that isn't merely neutral. that has a kind of investment. And this is what in psychology is called affectivity. And Freud felt that his big discovery is that all affectivity has a kind of sexual or is related to instinctual erotic drives, which he generalizes by the term libido. So we could say that the libido is a kind of psychic energy that undergirds all psychic states and that structures the psyche. And then the idea is that there's something called the drive or the will that is then related to the idea of the true will that I'm relating this concept to in Thelema, which is then an emergent property of this psychic field of affectivity of love energy, basically, that is then psychologically organized by will in order to then fuel the self, provide a reservoir of energy and motivation for then the subject to engage in various motivated activities. So the true will would then be the ideal organization of the libidinal force field of the psyche towards the maximum optimization of the particular self's, let's say, optimal potential for being, given their particular and unique historical circumstances. And that would be the true will as defined in Thelema. And you could also relate that very directly to Freudian psychoanalysis, certain basic categories. So this is what Crowley means by energy. And energy then is the fuel of trance, of the psyche's ability to continually transcend itself and develop itself. And so Crowley then relates this to the formula of tetragrammaton, which is the four-lettered divine name from the Jewish Kabbalah, Yod, which is spelled Yod, He, Vav, He. These correspond to the four elements, the four worlds that the reality is created through these four thematic stages. In other words, it can be generalized, and Crowley describes it as such in the chapter he dedicates to the formula of tetragrammaton in Magic and Theory and Practice. He generalizes this formula and defines it in that chapter as a general or universal formula of creation. And therefore of the magical will, understood either universally as a kind of process of God as nature or reality or nuit in Thelemic terms, but also of Hadid, of the particularized principle of the divine that is our own unique existence as human persons. And so we also would use this formula of tetragrammaton in order to work our will. So then energy is a way to characterize what the stuff is that is being then modified or affected or shaped by this formula to then manifest the will. And so the issue here then fundamentally is then how this energy, which is all that is to be structured and organized. And this, of course, is going to determine in what sense its expression is, as Crowley says, sacramental. In other words, imbued with meaning and purpose. And I think we would even say sacredness. And we need to remember then, if we're treating energy as kind of the fuel of trance, that in the Golden Dawn magical system, of which Thelema is drawing from, there is a fundamental distinction between trance and obsession. And so it's useful just to revisit this theme, because the ideal here is that will is a sequential structuring of energy that is meant to optimize the authentic potential for being in a positive, constructive, quote unquote, good sense. That being, of course, necessarily contextually defined. There is, of course, the klephotic alternative to that, which in the Golden Dawn magical tradition is called obsession. And this could be thought of as a kind of overruling of the psyche's authentic development by complexes that develop either neurotically or psychotically, potentially, in the psyche as the result of the inevitable trauma that relates to being a human being in this complicated world, both from initial socialization in our youth, but also on an ongoing basis. So the world is a complicated place and, involves an element of suffering, as was indicated a few weeks back when we were talking about the vision of sorrow, or the First Noble Truth of Buddhism. And this is something that is supposed to be overcome, but it's something that has to also be owned at the same time. So we have this alternative magic in terms of our choice to follow, let us call it the initiatory path, which is that the primary choice facing us is between trance or obsession, because either can be invoked by our magic. And so the goal of thelemic magic, in alignment with the principles of the AA, which seeks the enlightenment and emancipation and liberation of all of humanity, is to seek trance and to avoid and banish obsession. And so this would be the proper form of work of the thelemic magician. Okay, so Crowley identifies 3 different modes. Let's share our screen and take a look at this. This is kind of an interesting discussion. Hillary, would you be able to read kind of these next 2 immediate paragraphs? There are, however.
All right. There are, however, 3 main types of special experience which are noteworthy landmarks in the progression of initiation and of urgent practical value to the magician. The symbol of the sacrament being observed, they differ as do the 3 participants therein, the god, the priest, and the communicant.
Okay, so the symbol of the sacrament is sexual theurgy. This is the ritualization that is the symbolization that then works the magic that then manifests the sacrament, is whatever intercourse we might say in a very broad sense is occurring. Stephen, if you could pick up where he says in the highest.
In the highest, that is of Kether, the energy radiates wholly from oneself. That is, one is entirely identified with Hadid. In the middle, that of Hakma, the energy passes wholly through oneself. That is, one assumes the functions of Tahuti. In the lowest, that is of Gebura, the energy impinges wholly upon oneself. That is, one absorbs it as man.
Okay, and then Hillary, if you could pick up there.
In all cases, the energy of which it is here written, is not particular or personified. It is energy in itself without quality. The highest mode can only be fully apprehended by the ipsissimus. It is the final attainment. It is the active counterpart of the higher form of the beatific vision. The middle mode is proper to a magus, or to one aspiring to his prophetic function. It is described, and the method of attaining it is set forth in the book called Opus Lutetianum.
Yes, and this is sometimes also called the Paris working, and is a homosexual sex magical working that Crowley did in Paris. We'll say more about that in a moment. Keep going.
Okay. The lowest mode is the particular task of a major adept. It is best accomplished by means of the secret of the sanctuary of the gnosis, 9th degree OTO. Of the highest mode, it would be neither fit nor useful to treat more intimately. The middle mode concerns each magician in his particular and peculiar and private relations with the infinite, and demands from each of its adepts a special preoccupation. But of the lowest, it is convenient to make further mention.
Okay, and then he'll go on in a section that actually we're not going to talk about, but let's discuss these three modes: God, priest, communicant. So, God, this is Kether, or the ipsissimus. Now, he relates these particular grades, but remember that the magician is present in their existence on all levels of the tree. So in principle, these three modes are in fact available to any practicing magician. It's just that the idea is that you would, as you advance and become deeper in your understanding, they can take on a more special significance in relationship to the AA grade system. But I don't want to get too hung up on that. In principle, these are all just kind of different modes of the expression of energy through the sacramental ritual form of sexual intimacy. So first, where the magician takes on the role of the god or the divinity, and you're directly Hadid. And this is the ultimate horizon of magic, which is that you're so emptied into your relations that you become the kind of dynamic nothingness of the Kabbalistic zero. So although this is spoken of in terms of a kind of unity, that unity is precisely a unity because it's the whole, because it embodies all of the possible relationalities that are involved. So another way to put this is that from a phenomenological or philosophical point of view, remember this is our orientation for the class, human existence is innately ecstatic, meaning it's always outside of itself in its relations with the world. And so this is what Heidegger describes by saying that Dasein, or human existence, is in its very nature ecstatical or ecstatic. And it has a kind of being with as one of its ontological categories. So in its deepest form, this is that this would be expressed at that level. Then there's the priest, the Hokmah or Magus, where there's a kind of prophetic function, Crowley says, where you're taking on the role of Tahuti, the god of magic and prophecy. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by prophecy? So what prophecy does is that it's distinct from a more individual trance or vision in the sense that it has a larger social import, either universally or for some particular social group. So prophecy is the establishment or renewal of a kind of collective horizon of being, which facilitates agape, which facilitates human solidarity and love and community. So it's not, it's beyond just the sex magic where you're expressing intimacy or love, either in a circuit with yourself or with a partner. This is broader than that and encompasses potentially all of humanity with regards to the larger purposes of the great order. So in this sense, magic is expressing a kind of revolutionary liberation at the level of humanity as a whole. And now, Crowley's association of this function with the 11th degree, homosexual sex magic in particular, at least in his own case, does need to be kind of understood with, let's say, 3 qualifications. First of all, we see how Crowley writes that the middle mode concerns each magician in his particular and private relations with the infinite. Okay, so what that means is that the expression of this particular magical form, the prophetic mode of the manifestation of energy, is unique to each individual, and the form of its expression therefore can't be generalized. So, which then leads us to the second point, or qualification, which is that Crowley's association with queerness as a kind of mode of magical expression, and particularly prophetic magical self-expression, is of course relates to his personal sexual orientation, but it does have a potentially more universal significance, which is that his expression of this quality of queerness in a magical sense does relate to kind of a revolutionary attempt to overthrow heteronormativity as a restrictive legacy of the old eon. And linked to that are all kinds of other ideologies like patriarchy and so forth that he's trying to kind of, by knocking down heteronormativity, hopes to take out a whole swath of the superstructure of the old eon and create an opportunity for sexual liberation as one of many modes of human social liberation that is supposed to be facilitated in the new eon. And so given his personal sexual orientation, queerness in particular has a especially privileged place in Crowley's expression of his own formula as a magus, both to liberate himself in those terms, as well as to liberate others in those terms, including straight people who need to also be liberated from the limitations of heteronormativity. You know, this isn't just about what people are doing in bed. This is about the basic attitudes that we have in society where we are able to respect each other in our harmonious differences. And so sexual orientation is really an important key to that puzzle, but that also extends to race or class or all kinds of other categories that need to be liberated in the new eon from oppressive ideologies that derive from the old. Okay, and then our third point about this association, which is to actually say what Crowley's prophetic method actually is in a queer sex magical sense, which is that he especially experienced prostate gland stimulation, usually through penetration, as particularly stimulating his prophetic visionary capacity. And he uses this both in the Paris working that he mentions, and also in certain particular visions that he's having in the Vision and the Voice, one of his most important prophetic works, which is also contextualized within the context of a queer magical relationship he's having with his then magical partner, Victor Neuberg, as they go into the desert and have these visions of an intense magical apocalypse that's going to wipe away all forms of oppression. So the idea here is that each individual magician has to find some equivalent method that might or might not be queer or even involve sex formally in a formal sense in order to manifest this particular capacity. I would just point out, although we're not looking at Liber Aleph as a text in this class, Crowley makes some interesting comments in that text about what he calls eroto-comatose lucidity, and it's worth looking at those sections as an extracurricular activity because they connect to what we're talking about in this chapter. Okay, now the third mode, which is, you know, regular, good old-fashioned sex magic, usually with a partner. And again, this might be queer or straight, but is mostly kind of interpersonally relational on a kind of immediate level, where the magician is kind of personally with their partner trying to power up. And this is through some kind of standard socially oriented erotic intimacy involving another real or at least imagined partner. And this kind of magic, of course, involves the evocation of the phallus as a sacramental object. And this generates what Jacques Lacan calls jouissance, which is a kind of excessive blissful pleasure that the psyche has in its very existence, as it were, in its very self-expression of joyful, blissful self-existence. And of course, this is preeminently expressed in orgasm, but also just by affectivity itself. The very energy or psyche the very energy of the psyche is this jouissance that especially expresses itself as a kind of self-transcendence that leads to this structuring of the psyche through drive or will. And of course, this is all the stuff that Crowley is talking about in this chapter on energy. Okay, so I think if I wanted to sum up what he's talking about in this section, I would say that the differences between these three modes have less to do with the specific method used to invoke trance, the sexual technique, as it were, than with the underlying orientation assumed by the psyche during the operation. Personal, interpersonal, completely transcendent. You're just blissed out into complete transcendence of self. And those are your three levels. Again, the concept here of the state of being or existential hermeneutical orientation is what's at stake, because the goal of this kind of sex magic is to yes, Stephen, go ahead.
I just had a quick question. We talked about Kether, Hakma, and Gebura, and to me, those are points of energy. You can view Kether as the ultimate point, Hakma as the verb, and then Gebura as that manifested. I'm just like checking my understanding here. We're not talking about these other, say, like containers of energy, which would be like Hesed and Bina, because they represent maybe more like the bounds of that energy as opposed to that energy personified.
I
I'm just
guess,
I'm
sure,
trying to
sure.
understand what the skipping is, why there is skipping when normally we talk about flowing down the tree and its different energy components.
Sure. Crowley does jump around here, and certainly we could talk about other Sephiroth, like especially Yesod, for example, but you brought up and of course, all of these are modes of the beatific vision, and so that relates to Tifereth. But specifically with regards to Hesed, Hesed, so there's the phrase in the Book of the Law, love under will. Okay, Gebura is the will and Hesed's the love. Hesed is the general libidinal quality of the psyche that just is pure, energetic, loving everything. Gebura is the bounding of that gives it a kind of specificity. That's the underwill part of it. And I think Crowley's point here is that to avoid obsession, the trance needs to have a willed element. And so without Gebura, Hesed's actually very dangerous because it just floods you with energy and you just pop. And you lack the discrimination to be able to effectively, like, intimacy is about relationship, and you need boundaries to have relationship. And Gebura with Hesed. So when Crowley talks about Gebura, he's actually assuming that it also includes Hesed as what's leading into it. And then you have kind of the top level of the tree. And then he then, of course, presumes also all the stuff below it. And then the role of Bina is that Bina is Neshama, which is then, as it were, what Lacan calls the imaginer, which is the structuring of the psyche in terms of will. But then the manifestation of that is below the abyss, hence Gebura. And so anyway, that's a way to think about why he seems to be kind of skipping around. Obviously, we could also rewrite this chapter focusing on different Sephra, which is he picks these because he has a particular idea in mind, and he could have easily gone a different direction down the tree. So this is you're right that this is not an exclusive description.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. So anyway, I just want to point out one further comment that he makes here, which is that here at the where it says there is in fact, Hillary, could you read that?
Sure. There is, in fact, only one magical operation of whose propriety we may always be sure, and that is the increase of our sum of energy.
Okay, so what he's saying here, that's the principle, is that it's always right to seek love, basically. That there can be wrong ways you can go about that, but in principle, if you're seeking this development of the psyche in terms of love, that's always an appropriate, whatever magic that you're working to achieve that aim, whatever thaumaturgic stuff, sex magical working, whatever type of practical magic that you're working, that is always going to be appropriate and therefore theurgic in that positive sense. So you could say in a way that from the point of view of the law of Thelema, it is always lawful to seek love as your basic priority. That is and should be your agenda. And if you're doing that, you might make mistakes, but you can't go fundamentally wrong. Okay, let's talk about the next chapter, which is on knowledge in our remaining time here. Okay, I'm actually not going to read a whole bunch of this because basically the point that he's making in this chapter is that knowledge is subject to skepticism and therefore lacks a kind of ultimate truth or foundation. In other words, truth is always practical and contextual, and the knowledge that we have can't be universalized beyond the practicalities of our kind of our perspective. And what Crowley is attempting to do is to avoid dogmatism in this sense, so that everybody's unique point of view is, of course, respected, but then it's also acknowledged that these have to coordinate, as it were, to and that relates to the problem of the eon, which we won't be really talking about today, because this text is usually more concerned with the personal magical practice and how these themes, although Crowley will hint at their larger application, how they apply to our immediate magical practice. So first of all, Stephen, if you could read, just start us off in our chapter.
Doth, knowledge is not a Sephiroth. It is not on the tree of life. That is in reality no such thing. Of this thesis, there are many proofs. The simplest, if not the best, is perhaps as follows. All knowledge may be expressed in the form of S equals P. But if so, the idea P is really implicit in S. Thus, we have learned nothing. And of course, if not so, the statement is simply false. Now, see how we have come to what at once to paradox. For the thought there is no such thing as knowledge. Knowledge is a false idea, or however it may be phrased, can be expressed as S equals P. It itself a thing known.
So in other words, the skepticism is itself kind of knowing. So we're not like escaping the field of knowledge by calling it into question. Instead, we're demarcating the horizon within which we have to frame our inquiry about ultimate truth. Hillary, if you could read a little bit more.
Sure. Could you give us a quick answer as to what S and P are supposed to denote?
They're probably, in this context, they probably mean, and again, it probably assumes that you know this, they mean subject and predicate. And the reason is because, yes, because he's actually citing this from an argument that Leibniz is making about the distinction between a priori and a posteriori logical propositions, all of which he would have, is sort of basic undergraduate philosophy stuff that probably just assumes that you know. So that's why he's structuring the argument this way. This structure is in the form of what's called an analytical judgment, and don't worry about that. We don't have to know what that is. But does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
I was simply curious.
Yes, just go ahead and pick up where it says in other words.
And I have no philosophical background whatsoever.
Don't worry about it. We're going to figure this chapter out together right now. So
cool.
If you just pick up words, yes.
In other words, the attempt to analyze the idea leads immediately to a muddle in the mind. But this is of the essence of the occult wisdom concerning, how do you pronounce that? Doth? Doth.
Or Da'oth if you want to make it two syllables.
Okay, I've heard a lot of pronunciations. For Doth is the crown of the Ruach, the intellect, and its place is in the abyss. That is, it breaks into pieces immediately it is examined. There is no coherence below the abyss or in it. To obtain this, which is one of the chief canons of truth, we must reach neshama. Okay,
neshama is the wholeness of the psyche, is a kind of wholeness or totality that is absent in actual manifest reality, because everything that actually exists is partial. This is the great insight of Buddhism, that all existing things are shunyata, are lacking in an abiding self-essence. And this is also Crowley's position in what he calls the thesis of the Kabbalistic zero. Now, of course, this also means that all things are then dynamic and subject to self-transformation and evolution of their form. And so they can kind of intuit or reach towards a kind of totality in their being, and achieve, therefore, a kind of virtual or excess or surplus self-totalization in terms of what in magic is called the true will, that is otherwise lacking in reality, but it's something that we provide as human beings through our special mode of how we exist in the magical way that we exist, that we can then, as it were, complete reality. That if reality is innately incomplete, we can come along and attempt through our magical will to provide the missing element. And that missing element is the neshama. That's the holy grail, the sacred, that is able to through which we can kind of intuit a sacred wholeness that we can then be the vehicles of the manifestation of, and bring that. This is what in Kabbalah is called tikkun, or restoration. The idea being that reality is primordially broken apart, but that through mitzvot, through religious observance, or through magic, we can recombine or create new form that can then bring a sense of wholeness or sacred into the world. But in the meantime, we have this problem with our ideas, which is that, as Crowley says, these and similar considerations lead to certain types of philosophical skepticism. And he even says the shamanic conceptions are no wise exempt from this criticism, meaning, again, that the kind of wholeness that we're seeking is not, is probably poorly philosophically conceived as a kind of, it itself is dynamic. It itself leads us on to the next step. When we complete one step of the great work, there's another step that's positive beyond it. It's a kind of asymptotic ascent where we never reach complete totalization. There's always something outstanding, but we can, in the meantime, achieve more and more creative structure that adds interest and meaning and purpose to the world. Crowley uses the example of an architect. So he says, the conception is difficult. So he says, we may regard rational apprehension as a projection of truth in dualistic form. So he who possesses any given truth has only to symbolize it in terms of the intellect to obtain its image in the form of knowledge. So the kind of neshamic totality, we do need to symbolize it in language, and then we can achieve a kind of image or form of this wholeness that we're projecting ourselves towards. He says this conception is difficult. Stephen, if you could read this paragraph.
The conception is difficult. An illustration may clear its view. An architect can indicate the general characteristics of a building on paper by means of two drawings, a ground plan and an elevation. Neither but is false in nearly every respect. Each is partial, each lacks depth, and so on. And yet in combination, they do represent the trained imagination what the building actually is. Also, illusions as they are, no other illusions will serve the mind to discover the truth which they intend.
Okay, this synthetic quality of the human imagination, which Immanuel Kant calls the transcendental imagination, and which is also linked, Heidegger uses this as the basis for his theory of existential projection, the way that Dasein, or human existence, projects its possibilities for being, for authentic being in the world, through its activities and projects that it's engaged with in the world. And then I'm linking this idea to Crowley's notion of the true will. So the idea here is that the architect comes along and they conceive in their imagination a particular building, and then they perform actions, magic in other words, in such a way as to bring this into manifestation. This, of course, is the formula of Tetragrammaton, moving from the ideal to the real. And the mediator here is the Ruach, is the human imagination, which constructs a synthetic image that is greater than the whole of the parts. In other words, in nature, as a given, there's no such thing as buildings. But then human beings come along and they create a new type of space that isn't just there naturally. And then they live in that space and create modes of being within that space called human society, which are then facilitated by the kind of space that they create around themselves that they then live in. And this is kind of what we're doing all the time with our magical universe as we're constructing it around us. We're constructing a kind of house that we're going to live in. This is why Martin Heidegger likes to use this metaphor of what he calls the house of being. And he says that language is the house of being, meaning that the symbolic quality of the imagination, its linguistic form, allows us to posit structure that is greater than the whole of the parts, that isn't just naturally given in reality, that is a novel production that we're making, whether that's art or any other of the technological activities that human beings do as they live within, as they express what Heidegger calls being in the world. Okay, so what does this all have to do with knowledge? Okay, so let me try to sum this up in about 5 or 10 minutes, the point here. So knowledge is basically contrasted with understanding. So if knowledge is in Da'ath, understanding is in Bina, above the abyss, is the neshama, the vision of the totality. But Crowley's point is that knowledge and understanding are not really opposites. In other words, understanding is generated through a kind of alchemical refinement of knowledge by a process basically similar to the way that earlier in the book, he talked about how the trance of sorrow is mutated into the trance of wonder. In a similar process, knowledge can be alchemically transmuted into understanding, into the intuition of the neshamic whole, into the gnosis of the sacred. And but like the trance of sorrow, the germ of this transformation from knowledge to understanding derives from the incomplete quality of knowledge. It's the very contingent, limited, restricted quality of knowledge that paradoxically actually facilitates it being transformed into understanding. And again, this is counterintuitive, just like the movement from the trance of sorrow to the trance of wonder. So let me play out Crowley's argument here, because this is precisely where I think he's at his most interesting philosophically and most deeply in conversation with the Western philosophical tradition, particularly the so-called dialectical tradition that emerges out of Hegel and German idealism. So precisely by owning this quality of knowledge, namely it's incomplete, that it's susceptible to skepticism. What that means is that we gain access to the enlightened perspective that just as our knowledge is incomplete, reality itself is also in a similar fashion incomplete. And so therefore it's creatively malleable by the will to power of the true will. And so therefore the wholeness or totality that's lacking in reality can be speculatively imagined, and then we can project ourselves towards that form or image and bring it into reality. And this very existential projection is precisely open to new possibilities that aren't part of the previously given form of knowledge, because knowledge is incomplete, and so therefore there can always be more of it, you see. So the limitation becomes the advantage. This is the way this kind of dialectical, kind of negative logic or negative dialectic works. The limitation is itself the opportunity. Every time you put the glass down, it's half full. So because our knowledge is incomplete, we can always learn new things. And therefore, paradoxically, or rather dialectically, skepticism is precisely the basis for the true knowledge that is understanding. And hence, the series of skeptical arguments in this chapter, most of which we're kind of skipping over, are in order to grasp the main point that Crowley is making, which is this: that knowledge, which is the summit of reason, or the functioning of the Ruach, is completed through the operation of the neshama, a function that formally transcends the plane of the intellect. But this process in no sense involves the appeal to any kind of emotional intuitive faith, a maneuver which remains at the level of the nefesh, not of the neshama, and therefore below but not above the ruach. In other words, this is what Crowley is proposing as a kind of gnosis or Gnosticism, gnosis meaning knowledge, but knowledge in the sense of this sacred knowledge or understanding. And therefore that this is, gnosis has a salvific function that doesn't require pistis in the Pauline sense. It's just kind of allegiance to something that you emotionally believe in and obey, but you're rejecting the fact that your knowledge contradicts it. This is like the form of evangelical faith where you reject science, you reject reason, you reject knowledge. And Crowley's whole point in this chapter, the one to follow that we're going to look at next week, is that we shouldn't do this. That in fact, knowledge, which is admitted to be incomplete and necessarily though is the basis of the gnosis. And so therefore we should cultivate knowledge on the road to understanding. And then the method of that is a kind of skeptical inquiry, a kind of empirical scientific methodology. And this is what Crowley is appealing to in this chapter. So Thelema is on the side of knowledge or gnosis over and against blind, emotional, intuitive faith, which is the Christian old Ionic way of enslaving people by forcing them to believe things that they know are false so that they have to obey a false authority. Whereas the point of Gnosticism, of which Thelema is a version, is that we need to save ourselves. The truth shall set you free, it says in the Gospels. If I can be excused for citing that text. And so we have to figure, we have the responsibility to figure that out. And we need science to do that. And so we should not reject, Crowley's point is basically we should not reject science as part of the magical quest for knowledge. Okay. And so then the question then is raised within this philosophical theory of knowledge, what then is truth? And I'm going to defer that question, but I'm going to raise it, and that's because that's ultimately the theme of the book as a whole. And so I'm over anticipating if I say too much more about that at the present. The final chapter of this book is entitled Truth, and we're going to get Crowley's going to answer that question. Okay, so I think we've covered everything that I have to say about these two chapters. So what I want to do now is we've got a little more than 10 minutes, which is better than we've done before. So let's open to questions now, and let's try to have a conversation about some of these ideas here.
Sure. I was wondering, when we talk about knowledge, we often talk about, the combination of Hakman Vina, like understanding and wisdom produces knowledge. And I'm kind of wondering, like, in this map of the soul, as well as when we're mapping knowledge, where does like Choronazon, I know Choronazon is the dweller in the abyss and the one who, can either consume or destroy the ego or knock the magician back to whatever level on the tree. And I'm kind of wondering like how all that plays into this, like, because we're talking about obtaining universal knowledge
Yes, but it turns out, and this is the Thelemic twist, for knowledge to be universal, it has to be uniquely particular to the universality of your hadith, your point of view.
Oh, so like
it still has to be
creative causal principle is the uniqueness, and anything beyond that is, you can't define that because you're the creative causal principle of your own universe.
Well, yes, but also let's just sort of follow this train of thought a little bit.
Okay.
If truth with a capital T has to be personal, if in other words, as Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, says, subjectivity is truth. In other words, we can't get away from the fact that we all, as our unique perspectival, we all have our unique perspectival point of view. And so our truth can never exactly coincide with any other unique point of view's truth. We always have the uniqueness of our own point of view. And Crowley's point is that the universal truth is the recognition that that's the case. That's the universal truth.
I see.
And so is perspectivism. And so that means that if we're going to get along, we have to be in dialogue with each other. We have to respect the fact that other human existences have a uniqueness that we can't consume or overwhelm with our own uniqueness. And we have to as brothers fighting you, we have to come together in a kind of solidarity as the company of heaven to work out the more complex structures that we need to have a kind of society with each other where we respect each other, based on the fact that there is no universal position that everybody's going to accept from their own point of view. That there's always a kind of diversity going on that's going to overwhelm any attempt to achieve totality. But we have to include that recognition within the project of what we're doing. I think that's the point that Crowley's making.
So we often talk about below the abyss as the subjective thing, and I think Crowley is quoted as saying like his Jove is not your Jove.
Sure. Above the abyss is objective, but only intersubjectively. Let me explain what I mean.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that?
Yes, this is an important point. Let me give you a little bit of, so let me answer the question of who Choronzon is by first talking about Hokmah in relationship to Bina, because we're talking about a triad of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, right? As that triad of those three separate.
Yeah.
And then there's the underlying unity of that triad, which is Kevin. So this is a kind of depending reflection of that. So, and this then is how the supernals bridge down into the lower tree. Okay, but what does that mean? Okay, Crowley defines Hokmah as what he calls chaos, whereas, of course, Bina is Babylon. So it's chaos and Babylon above the abyss, right? Okay, well, chaos in what sense? Crowley defines chaos as the totality of the units of existence. Okay, but the units of existence are what the Book of the Law calls numbers, of which are infinite. And number includes all references to units or things. So it includes words. So all words are numbers. In other words, all signifiers are numbers, which means that all language is what the Book of the Law means by number. But that means that Hokmah is then the structure of language itself. It's what Jacques Lacan calls the symbolic order. It's the form or structure, the logos, literally, the semantical form of language. But then that has to be embedded within our psyche. And that occurs as what Lacan calls the imaginary, which is the structuring of the psyche in terms of language. And that's neshama, which is Bina. So that's Hokmah, and then that's Bina. And then that structuring of language then produces or facilitates the ability for then us to learn language and then to form mental thoughts and concepts and have ideas and so forth. And that's the Ruach and the functioning of the Ruach. So the supernals are the impersonal and therefore in that sense universal structure that then facilitates the personal experience of being self-consciousness, which is the Tiferet function. And it's below the abyss in the sense that it's a kind of personal experience. And when we realize that there's this impersonal basis to that, and then get in kind of communication with that horizon, that's the intuition of neshama, or the intuition of the supernals. Okay, so the abyss, or the function of the abyss, because remember, Choronzon is dispersion, and so therefore Choronzon doesn't have the kind of is not itself a totality, does not itself have, in fact, it's the principle of not kind of being itself. Or in other words, as Crowley puts it, the devil is defined by Christianity as that entity which most certainly does not exist. Actually, that's Eliphas Levi who says that, but I think it's cited somewhere by Crowley. But Choronzon stands for a particular function, which is the fact that all manifest beings have what Buddhists call shunyata. They lack an abiding self-essence. And so they're subject to the dynamic change. And that change is a kind of negativity. It's death, basically, but death that gives birth to new life. And the fact that all things are subsumed to that actually have manifest being, that function or reality is what the abyss stands for. And so Choronzon is simply the symbolic, is simply the symbol or metaphor for that, and therefore the spirit of that, and could be evoked in that sense. If that answers your but these are
Yeah,
the
I mean that was great. I think it's just like a something that's come up a lot. Like I think I've have understood the disparate ideas of like the Hawkman Bina producing the reflection of Keter and Doth and all of that. I think Karanzan is like is also a reflection of the weirdly like I want to say like the Kabbalistic zero, like the no
Oh,
thing.
yes, no, you're right. This is
Yeah,
right.
it
It's a
is a
sigma
no
non.
thing, but it's a lower form of the no thing.
That's right.
Uh,
So it's
yeah,
what's called in earlier theosophical literature, the dweller on the threshold. It's this kind of figure that is ultimately a reflection of yourself and your own self nature that you have to kind of achieve the gnosis of, that allows you to then again in trance to transcend that limit. But it has to involve a comprehension of what the meaning of that very limit is. And then you can encompass that limit, and then you can be beyond it, is how the
right.
kind of dialectic of that works. Anyway, I do want to get to Hillary. If you have anything you want to talk about or ask or discuss in our last few minutes here.
Um, over and over, when you've been talking about this, you're talking about intuition as if this is, you know, something very, lower planes oriented. And what we're trying to do is evolve or develop spiritually so that we don't need to rely on intuition. Intuition, how are you defining that?
Good question, because I in fact have two distinct senses of this. One is good, one is less good. That I have been using and perhaps not distinguishing, making them distinguished adequately. So the good sense of intuition is this ability that our imagination has to grasp totalities or to speculate and imagine wholes that are that we're able to kind of posit and project ourselves towards. And this is what's called neshama and relates to Bina on the tree of life. And it's the goal of what we're seeking in magical practice, is a kind of higher intuition of this ability that we have to kind of intuit the sacred in this sense. The more pejorative sense of intuition that I'm referring to is in the sense of like the way that we're obsessed by unconscious complexes in like Freudian psychoanalysis, that when we're involved like in the dream work or whatever, we might become obsessed by particular images or motifs that relate from maybe past trauma that we have to kind of like understand and overcome. And it would also be a type of thinking that again, in a pejorative sense, isn't intuitive, or excuse me, isn't intuitive in the good sense, but thinks that it is falsely, where you're kind of rejecting the pieces of reason that you need to have in place to then intuit this larger whole, and you don't have enough pieces to put together. And so instead you're intuiting something that isn't really valid or contributing, that might be based on prejudice or again, trauma, or just not knowing enough about what's going on. And when people jump to conclusions or whatever, but they say, oh, I'm just going with my gut, but really they don't know what they're talking about or something like that. That's the pejorative kind of intuition. So we're trying to discriminate between the two in magic.
Okay,
but they're both intuition.
And that's the sort of intuition that, you're maintaining, that, for example, evangelical Christians are sort of opposing to science and rationality.
Exactly. What they call faith, which is basically just a kind of obscene prejudice that's justified through a kind of completely irrational dogmatism that they've decided is the truth because they can control other people by demanding that this kind of preposterous world picture they have is true.
They hope that we don't know that there's two different kinds of intuition.
Maybe, or whatever. But
or so like to
yes.
Maybe put a finer point on this, then maybe part of the great work then is unifying these two ideas of intuition, such that the false intuition and the intuition you gather by collection of experiments in science no longer gives way to the false to a faith-based intuition.
Sure, that's one way to put it. It's just we're trying to grow. And that growth is in terms of a wholeness that's supposed to encompass more and more things in a way that they can constructively relate to each other. And that's the kind of goal of the magical projection. Anyway, we're at 4 o'clock, so we're gonna have to stop. Thank you both for joining me this week, and of course we'll be continuing next week with the next class. So I'm gonna sign off now, but thanks again for joining us. Love is the law, love under will.
93.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys. 93.